We're here to talk about today a video that we put out just a couple days ago about Djokovic's historic win in Australia. And there were a lot of great comments on that video. And I think it's worthwhile to discuss some of the more meaningful ones because some really great points were raised. And it also gives us a chance to dialogue with all of you guys who are out there like looking for good information and on topics that can be seen in different ways. So I want to point out a couple of really great comments that were made. One by Milos Mitutinovic, as well as someone that wrote under the name of Egyptian Hibiscus. And both of these comments were reflective of other people who said that Djokovic is too great a champion and has too much class to give a raspberry to the crowd or in your face or, flip people off. And
Which,
you're
by the way,
absolutely
we
right.
we learned recently is this, right?
Yeah,
So,
I,
that's what
I
it
don't
is.
know. I think that's what the raspberry is. But,
you know,
the sort of indignant, like, screw you guys, I won it. And of course, you guys are right. I think Djokovic is a consummate champion and a great sportsman. He would never do that. Um, so that is true. And what I really meant to say was I was hoping that he would say something like, a lot of people have suffered like I did because of these restrictions, and especially people like you Australians who are out here enjoying this great event. And for all of those that are out there enjoying it, there's lots of people in Australia that could not come out or leave their house other than to go to a grocery store because of their vaccination status. So I was hoping for that kind of acknowledgement, and it didn't come, but that's okay. The point here is that Djokovic is a true champion and would not say anything like that. And this was reflected by another viewer named Adam D, who said that Djokovic said in his speech, "Never let anyone take your dream away." And I really liked what he said there, Adam. I like what you said, which is Djokovic is pointing out the fact that he's trying to give some inspiration to young players, but he's also alluding to the fact that at the time it probably seemed like he would never be able to play in a Grand Slam event again if we had these kinds of restrictions. There was no sign that Australia's government was going to relent at some point, and he was actually facing the possibility that he would not ever be able to compete in countries that were hosting events where it was required to be vaccinated to enter. So it was, I think, a tip to all those people out there who are facing a situation that you don't think is ever going to change, and to stick with your convictions. So that was a strong statement that Djokovic made in his commentary after winning.
So I got one here. Enjoyed the name, I got to say, Shane Shrimp. I just thought it made me chuckle. It made me chuckle. But he says it amazes me how people talk discrimination with race, sects, etc., but they don't talk shit about this type of discrimination when it comes to the vax. It's so ridiculous. And I think this is a good point because there was a ton of discrimination, and it was like people were told you're supposed to discriminate against the unvaccinated. I mean, this came down from governmental levels down. I mean, here in Canada, our own prime minister was the height of creating and sowing discrimination against the unvaccinated people. We saw headline after headline blaming unvaccinated people for what was going on. I mean, we all know that the vast majority of that stuff has been shown to be untrue at this point. But, since when do we just listen to what somebody tells us about who to discriminate against, right? Like we're told, hey, you're not allowed to discriminate against these people. And so we all, stay in line. And then now it's like, okay, now go discriminate against these people. And people went and did that. And I also think to some extent, we're seeing a little bit of discrimination now from the unvaccinated to the vaccinated, kind of pointing at like, oh, you're not clean. You're not a pure blood. You're not this, right? So we're kind of seeing that this human element goes depending on, kind of which way the wind is blowing at any given time. But I mean, when is discrimination really ever kind of the right way forward? So, I thought that was an interesting piece to bring up in this dynamic as well.
for sure. And I think some of the powerful energy you saw protesting against some of these vaccine policies were that the vaccinated and unvaccinated together at protests saying, hey, I'm vaccinated. Another person saying I'm unvaccinated. But, we're against these authoritarian mandates that are undercutting basic personal liberty and bodily autonomy. Likewise, it's powerful, when men show up at reproductive rights rallies to stand for the bodily autonomy of women to do what they want with their reproductive system. I think these are instructive in the sense of how we can create intersectional movements to have each other's back, regardless of our personal preferences or decisions. If you stand for a policy or philosophy like bodily autonomy, that should apply broadly. That shouldn't apply piecemeal when it pertains to your particular group or your particular category, right? So
Yep.
it's special to see when people can rally together in that spirit.
Hmm.
Yeah, look, let's run a thought experiment. Let's say that at some point in the next few days, it becomes well understood, hypothetically, that vaccinated people are shedding something that is dangerous. Now, imagine the outrage there would be, honestly, if people say, "Oh, you're vaccinated, you can't go in that restaurant, you can't go to work, unless you wear, some sort of like, cellophane body bag to keep the spike proteins in." I mean, that would be outrageous, right? But that's not so different than what happened 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And we have to ask ourselves the question, like, what kind of world do you want to live in? Is it worth
Yeah.
taking the risk of being around someone who, may be some kind of threat? Uh, or is it better to say, I want to live in a world where we all can be together and, mitigate the risk any way we can, but let's treat each other like human beings.
And I think one of the key things to that is at the time, it was known that most of what was being done to create this propaganda, this discrimination against unvaccinated people did not hold water, right? Like it's not like they were doing their best saying what they were saying at the time. Most of these statements did not hold water back then, and they don't hold water today. And so that's an important point that often gets lost too, is people will say, well, back then we were just doing our best. We thought it's like, no, it was clear back then. But they went forth with it anyway.
Right, Joe. Look, it was clear, it seemed clear back then, but the point is it's never 100% clear. Like, what do we
Hmm.
do when there's uncertainty? That's the question. That's the
Yeah.
that's the test of humanity is what do you do when you're not sure? How do you treat another human being? And, we have to come to grips with what the correct response is.
Yeah.
So we've got Jimmy who says, look at Rafa, referring to Rafael Nadal, after this Kovacs, a very healthy guy suffering with chest pains, etc. I hope he won't be one of those athletes that just collapses and falls to the ground with no reason. Last I checked, Nadal had won 2 Grand Slam titles just less than a year ago. So I think he's doing fine. He's also into his late 30s. Listen, I can't imagine the kind of durability it takes to have that kind of dynamic of a ground game for that long into your late 30s and still be winning Grand Slam. So I would say Nadal is not suffering as much as Jimmy might suggest here. But this gets to what you touched upon, Joe, to where there's this energy of people who say, listen, if we didn't take the vaccine, we're pureblood. We're more physically optimized to perform and be more dynamic in athletics. And I mean, to me, it'd be one thing if there seemed to be some truth to that. If we could point to athletes who are just falling out of sports en masse, saying I can't perform anymore because I have cardiovascular issues. Now there are isolated cases of that happening. That is happening. I'm not saying it's not happening, but we're not seeing elite athletes sort of fall out of competition. LeBron James is 38, year 20, vaccinated, probably playing better than anybody who's ever played at that age. I think that your physical optimization probably has a lot more to do with other lifestyle habits as opposed to whether or not you took a vaccine.
Yeah, I mean, multifactored here, right? And at the same time, I think context is important. I think everything very, very quickly and easily got thrown out of context when we were talking about many COVID-related things because everything just kind of diverged into sides, like people competing with one another about their truth and what was going on. And critical thinking kind of broke down on both sides to some extent. And, I think that's kind of the beauty of the show we're trying to produce here and what we're trying to create is like, how do we actually move forward making sense of things, trying to, see clearly what's going on and not get caught up in one narrative or another, but really holding the context of what is actually happening and at what rate and what is going on. And of course, not just about COVID, but many other topics. But, the idea here is how do we not get caught up in narrative capture, which I think is a huge thing that a lot of people were falling prey to, unfortunately, for quite a while.
And 100%. And also think about it, a lot of the understandable objections to the authoritarian COVID policies were that people felt that unwellness was being projected upon them if they didn't take the vaccine. Meaning, hey, if you don't take this, you're not well enough to go out in public and travel and get on a
Yeah.
plane, right? And now to sort of mirror that and say, no, we're the purebloods here because we didn't take the vaccine, and there's something wrong with you physically, right?
Mm.
That is an ugly cycle that we have to break if we're going to find any kind of commonality and get beyond this.
Totally, 100%. Look, that's the whole thing. How we set ourselves up to react in very, very bad ways by the way we've treated each other for the last 2 years. The idea that Nadal may be I think the what was intimated in that is that Nadal could fall over any time because he was vaccinated, and wouldn't that be a great thing for the anti-vax movement? And obviously, we're better than that. However, it's not so easy to pull apart there, and I understand what you're saying, David, is that there's sporadic incidences of elite athletes that are collapsing. It's not so hard. It's not so easy to figure out, is this more than what we should be expected historically? But the best we can make in terms of a comparison is there another elite tennis player that has suffered from a vaccine injury? And the answer is yes, there is. And has he been biochemically tested? But I'm referring to Jeremy Chardy from France, who was the number two player in France, at least when he was playing, and he was vaccinated in the summer of 2021, I believe. And as of October 2022, he still hasn't been playing, and he blames it's on the vaccine. So this is a very complicated topic. It's akin to the same thing as someone who is vaccinated and gets COVID and says, "Oh, thank God I was vaccinated because I'm alive." Like, that is not enough to say that the vaccine is actually the cause of your survival. Similarly, an unvaccinated person who gets COVID and survives, like, "Oh, thank God I wasn't vaccinated." It's like, how do you know? You have to look at aggregate data, which, we don't have to do that now, obviously, but
Right.
it's narrative capture is the point, and that's what drives us to the wrong direction. But your point is well made. Why are we insinuating or hoping or intimating that people get hurt?
Right.
And I hope we're better than that.
As if somehow we'll be vindicated from that, right? On either side, right? It's
Yeah.
really a vicious cycle. And, I think in the United States, like the NFL, the NBA, for example, they've got a 95 plus vaccination rate. And, I think to me, if there was something really happening there, I think we would see it on a much with more regularity. It is happening. Listen, I know that there are reports and they should all be investigated and taken seriously. We can talk about bears all day long, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, these should all be investigated. But I think to point out an isolated incident and relate that to the aggregate as if the exception is now the rule, which some people are doing, to me, it's just unnecessary. It's unnecessary to make the point I think people are trying to make by saying that, everyone's going to drop down and elite athletes are all of a sudden going to drop for no reason when we're not seeing that. That's my point there.
Yeah.
It's great. It's great that we're having this discussion. I would say all of this controversy would be put to rest if everybody was absolutely transparent when someone gets hurt.
Yeah.
What was his vaccination status? When did he have COVID? Put those together. Like, why is that so secret? Like, oh, we can't. Of course, it wasn't the vaccine. We know it wasn't the vaccine. That's why we don't even mention it. That's not the way to get to the bottom of things. So
Yeah.
we're really pushing back against the lack of transparency, and if we had that, I think that we could come to the table with a better understanding of what's going on and have a real discussion about what might be happening.
For sure, for sure. So moving on, Vincent says, "Thanks so much for the humorous take and the good vibes." Yeah, we appreciate that, Vincent. Listen, I'm not sure what take he thought was the best humor. I think Joe kind of had some great sports analogies to spike proteins and tennis balls and basketball. So maybe, but listen, we're trying to be fun here. And listen, the three of us, we've got a lot of love for each other, and we have a lot of love for you, the audience listening. And I think what's lost in these contentious debates is just a sense of goodwill towards each other.
Yeah.
To say, regardless, we can debate vigorously, but that doesn't mean we have ill will towards each other just because we vehemently disagree with any particular topic. We are trying to bring good vibes, and we appreciate your good vibes. So thank you, Vincent.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and I have to say this because just to be very clear about medical misinformation, because at the end of the video, David, you talked about the tennis racket protecting, right? That's not at all what we're saying, because we know that a tennis racket will not prevent the transmission of aerosolized particles. But if you have two tennis rackets,
Oh,
however,
yeah.
Right.
that works better.
Intersecting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
We
now
agree.
we're definitely going to get flagged for misinformation on that because,
Okay.
listen, I think the tennis racket might mitigate 0.23% of the particles.
Yeah.
So it's something, something.
It's
Got to have
misinformation.
two.
And finally, Supernova Baust says Australia has the highest life expectancy rates out of Croatia, the US, and most Western countries. This is due to their excellent handling of the COVID pandemic. And listen, this is interesting because Australia is amongst the highest rated countries when it comes to life expectancy rates, meaning the population does well, they age well, and presumably they're healthier longer than other countries. I think they were number 8 last we checked. And there's a point there, right? Because Australia also has some of the highest vaccination rates in the world. So if the vaccine was really killing people at a significant clip, Australia would be plummeting in that, given that their vaccination rate is higher than most of the countries on that list. What do you think?
Well, I mean, on the on the COVID front and the COVID policy front, I mean, it all depends on where Australia was on that list prior to. I mean, everything's all going to be relative. I mean, at the end of the day, all this stuff is multifactored. I mean, COVID did have its effects as a pandemic on killing people. I'm not sure that it was, enough to just absolutely tear, death rates beyond levels that are, just massive when we're talking about it across an entire country. But I do think that, the point you make about vaccine and there being, not huge amounts of people dying and dropping dead from these vaccines, I think that really is where I have my biggest gripe with this conversation around this discussion, is because like I do think injuries are happening, but like you said, I don't think it's happening at this rate where like everybody is dropping dead. And it's making it that people are, in my view, kind of talking about the wrong thing a lot. Like they're trying to see it as either it's not happening or it's happening to like everybody, that it's just this massive genocide. And the reality is all the people that it's actually affecting kind of just get lost in the wind of these extreme viewpoints. And I don't know. That's my take on it.
Yeah, well said, Joe. That's exactly right. I mean, when you have this kind of pressure on a population, whether that be from the disease or from a vaccine that might be deleterious, you're not gonna, unless someone told you about it, you wouldn't know. You really wouldn't. I mean, like, one person out of 110 dies every year in this country. That's the mortality rate in the United States, right? And if we say in the first year 250 to 300,000 excess deaths occurred from COVID, we're talking about just a 10% change in that. So it's like instead of seeing 1 out of 110 people die, we see 1 out of 100 people die. I mean, it's hard to see that, honestly. So unless you have a huge effect, it's not going to be obvious. But the other point that I want to say here is what Joe said is correct. Like, where was Australia before? And if you were saying that, look, the vaccination rate and the quarantines were so effective in Australia, that's why their life expectancy is high. What is that? That's called a correlation. It's a correlation. It's not a causation, right? But when you talk about injuries, it's like, oh, there's just a correlation. It's not causation. So we have a double standard. That's the example of a double standard that comes out when we're talking about. We know that it was the vaccine and the measures that are protecting Australians. No, that's just a correlation. Okay, just like all of the people who reported, or the families reported that they died within 24 to 48 hours after getting vaccinated, and then they're being gaslighted and with this correlation causation double standard. So we have to be careful with
Yeah.
that.
Right. Yeah. And then, on this list too, a lot of these rankings could have nothing to do with COVID or the vaccine, which is also possible. People are always kind of looking at things like, now if somebody coughs, they're like, oh my, is it COVID? Is it the vaccine? It's like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
there's, thousands of other things we deal with every day. Right. So it's an interesting discussion, but yeah, listen, we appreciate your comments. We're talking about tennis, which is fun. And obviously we have our own style. I tend to prefer Federer, Madova's former favorite tennis player. He was just super elegant with it. But we had a lot of Serbian fans chime in, and obviously I'm sure they love Djokovic, wonderful player. And one mentioned, he said, "Listen, I really appreciated your conversation on Djokovic, but why was it necessary to say that you weren't necessarily a fan of his?" And it's a good point, because we're not here to say we like this person or we don't like that person. And I should have been more eloquent with what I was trying to articulate there. We're just saying that when it comes to style and the way a tennis player carries themselves, we all have different preferences. It's the reason why some people prefer Djokovic, plays with such immense force, versus somebody like Federer who's more elegant and seems effortless with his play. And so, big shout out to Djokovic. I mean, I like him. I'm not saying
As a
I don't like.
human,
Yeah, right. As a human being, and we don't know these people, of course. We're just talking fun. We're talking sports. So, no offense meant or intended there. And congrats to Djokovic for a historic Grand Slam title.
that's all.